Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we got another unscripted movie review, this time about the sequel to The Incredibles, Incredibles 2. So, full disclosure, I didn't actually see the first Incredibles movie from Disney and Pixar until, my college years, I think. I completely missed out on a lot of the hype when it was coming out in my formative years. It was just a Pixar movie I didn't really see. I mean, I saw Ratatouille in theaters, I saw WALL-E in theaters, I saw all the Toy Story movies in theaters, but The Incredibles, they kind of passed me by. And even going back to the film now, I wouldn't consider it among a top-tier Pixar movie for me. And you have to understand how significant that is for someone like me, because at that time, in those formative years when I was growing up, it could have very easily become the sort of work that fed directly into my worldview. Because as a teenager, I was kind of obsessed with something like this. Yeah, I'm not exactly proud of it. You can't see it from here. This is Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. And it's like my 50th anniversary copy. I've gone through it a couple of times. It's kind of hilarious in hindsight. But at the same time, I talk about this because it feeds in that story that Ayn Rand put forward was surrounding the philosophy of objectivism. The individualist belief that you yourself, taking a self-interested portrayal of the world, you can rise, you can transcend, you can be better than the masses. The masses that will think whatever they want to believe and whatever they fear to believe. And they will fall into that trap, and yet using all of your own specific powers and strengths and privileges, you can transcend, you can bring that sort of benevolent rule to the masses. You can be better than them. It really does have a certain amount of appeal to a certain very white, very conservative demographic. And when I was 15, 16, 17, that's what I was. I'll freely admit that. I freely admit that these sort of books actually spoke to me. And specifically, because hearing that if you go back to read The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged, they really aren't that good of books. I got into them through Terry Goodkind's series, The Sword of Truth series. It's more of fantasy grounding. He's a better author than this. And this is actually the one that really hammers in the objectivist subtext and makes it text. It's called Faith of the Fallen. It's actually a legitimately great book, even if I've kind of outgrown the philosophy. I say all this because I get the appeal of objectivism, and I get the appeal that runs underneath it, especially as somebody who would look out and be privileged or put upon in that sort of case, and you think you can be better than all that. You can rise, you can lead, you can take people in a grand new direction. It's aspirational, it's inspirational. Until you go into a philosophy classroom on your first couple of weeks of university, and you bring this up to a philosophy professor and he kind of laughs in your face, because it brings up to the mind that, yeah, sure, rooted self-interest makes a certain amount of sense. You can't aspire in that direction until that entire philosophy relies on everybody having an equal playing field. And everybody starts off from the same point. If that was true, then maybe it might have a little bit more merit. You look out for yourself, and you do use that self-interest to bring better purpose for everybody, including you. If you happen to be on top, well, you earned it then. But not everybody has that equal playing field. And there are systems in place that will actively strive against that equal playing field. Somebody who grew up middle to upper class and then was able to aspire above that even playing field, I certainly as hell have certain privileges that I came from my perspective. The average person who's a woman, or who is black, or who is gay, or who falls under certain other categories who are discriminated against, I don't start from that playing field. So, in order to break down those systems, one person typically cannot do it alone in a civilized democracy, which is why a lot of hardcore libertarians who want to dismantle governments, they tend to fall in line with objectivism real quickly, because it's an individualist philosophy. They don't believe in that sort of large-scale collective action to change systems and level the playing field. And part of it is also driven off the fact that people like me, we have this belief that even if the playing field was level, we'd still transcend everybody else. And it comes from a monstrous amount of hubris. Why do I bring all this up? Because it's kind of philosophical for a movie review. Well, Brad Bird, specifically the director behind The Incredibles and a couple of other Pixar movies, he has subscribed to the theories that come out in Randian objectivism and that self-interest. And that specifically becomes a pretty loaded set of subtext in The Incredibles. You have Dash saying, well, if everybody's special, nobody is. But that's the thing. It plays very well to the superhero narrative. It is something of a deconstruction of the superhero narrative and showing, yeah, being a superhero might have consequences if you are a family man in that sort of environment. But if when you are a superhero and you have benevolent intentions, you can transcend. You can make it all better for everybody. Right? And just you're the one who can do it. And as such, going back to watch The Incredibles, it's a great movie. The scripting is really tight. The action sequences are amazingly inventive. Brad Bird has always had an eye for that sort of picture. But the philosophical subtext, once you go past a lot of it doesn't always resonate in the same way, and thus I would not go back to it in the same way I would Ratatouille or WALL-E or Inside Out or the Toy Story trilogy, or even Cars 3, which I actually like a fair bit more than I think I'm supposed to. And you know what? At that point, everyone was saying, as much as they wanted a sequel, Incredibles 2, it was a pipe dream because Brad Bird wanted to go on and do other things, like, say, Tomorrowland, and remember how that turned out? Or how much of a mess that movie was? But that's the thing, you have films like Tomorrowland that tank, and he comes back to Hat in Hand with the Pixar, and basically like, let's just make an Incredibles sequel. It's bound to spend a lot of money, and it certainly did. And honestly, it's not even better than Incredibles 1. I'm not saying it's a bad movie in terms of sheer style and color, in terms of the lot of the presentation of the movie. I'd argue that in terms of animation, it is markedly better than Incredibles 1. But when you start to dig a little bit deeper into the foundational narrative of the story and how it's actually constructed, it's nowhere close to being as impactful as other Pixar movies. And again, this is not related to the philosophy behind it, because yes, the objectivism comes back in, but the way it comes back in is the problem, not the philosophy itself. Because again, when it comes to a superhero narrative, it's kind of hard to avoid some of that strong individualist flavor come back in. But at the same time, when you have the superhero narrative, it really does kick off as a very close, very direct sequel to Incredibles 1. So you might want to go watch Incredibles 1 beforehand. But you have basically the family, they're now on the run again, except now they've been approached by a multi-millionaire tycoon who wants to legalize and bring superheroes back into the spotlight. But there's a character who's using our screens to hypnotize people and pull them away, turn them against superheroes at large. And yet, the key thing is that business tycoon goes to the family and says, no, Mr. Incredible, you're not the face of this. Elastigirl is gonna be. And that's actually a key point, because it very much plays into a different sort of narrative in terms of developing and expanding her character. She easily has the most defined, established arc in the story, even if it does kind of play to some of those objectivist hallmarks. Meanwhile, Mr. Incredible, he's trying to deal with his teenage daughter, his young child son, and of course the new baby, and baby Jack's starting to manifest some powers in his own way that are all the more wild and unpredictable. And you know what? If you're going to actually take a look at anything when it comes to this movie, the sheer comic set pieces and some of the sets are amazingly funny and well-timed. In terms of just the plain, low-key superhero stuff that plays more to the comedic side, I think it's actually legitimately great. I think a lot of Mr. Incredible, yeah, it's playing to a Mr. Mom harried subtype, but in terms of some of the inventiveness of the actual struggle that he's going through and trying to balance off in the interplay that he has with a really strong set of characters, it comes together really well. And it's nice seeing a traditional deconstruction and showing him at least trying to take a slightly more modern spin on it. Honestly, his parts of the movie, even if it does show some kind of abortive character arcs when it comes to, say, Dash or Violet, I ultimately didn't care all that much because the ride was so fun. The problem is that this movie's not all about that ride, and a lot more of the movie is focused on the arc of Elastigirl and actually going out and solving crimes and showing what she can actually do to bring superheroes back into the light of day. I'd like to say that all of it works, except in between those grand set pieces that are admittedly very impressive, the movie has a bad habit of stopping the momentum dead to have, quite literally at one point, a cocktail party where they bandy about points surrounding human worth and individualism versus collective action, and how those right and smart people could be given the chance if they had the opportunity, but in reality, we don't always fall into that role. And there's an interesting gender dynamic that comes considering that the primary person that Elastigirl is interacting with is the sister of that business tycoon, the real inventor behind the whole plan to bring them back. While the twist there behind that whole interaction is pretty telegraphed, you can probably pick it up if you've seen seen these sort of movies, it's still well enough done that I appreciated it. The problem is that, well, I hate to say it, but the stakes kind of felt a little bit undercooked. Part of this is the introduction of Jack, who has so many powers that you get the feeling he can kind of take care of all this by himself. But at the same time, a lot of it comes with the fact that this movie keeps trying to stop the momentum midway through to bring up the philosophy. And it's probably the most explicit that it's been moved into the text of the film instead of the subtext. And sure, there's a point in that, but it's often a big problem that comes with objectivist narratives. One reason that Atlas Shrugged, it becomes so infamous in some literary circles, there's at least over a dozen pages, well, it's like 70 to 80 pages, dedicated to an extended monologue on the virtues of individual action and objectivism. It utterly drives the narrative to the halt because you get the feeling that the director and the overall screenplay is a lot more interested in the philosophy than any actual narrative character development. And that's kind of a shame because that back and forth with the kids, the more comic set pieces, they're easily the points of this movie that are of the most highlights. Sure, I appreciate the philosophical underpinnings because, I can actually follow some of the conversations that are clearly being had between Elastigirl and her female counterpart on the other side. I can follow the discussion there from a philosophical point. It's fascinating. Hell, I'd like to go to those cocktail parties. But at the same time, they also feel kind of ham-fisted, and you get the feeling a lot of it's going to fly over the heads of the younger audience. And you can tell specifically because, of course, they put in a little piece ahead of time in the movie where Brad Bird's saying, take the whole family, take somebody out on a date for this movie. It was a little featurette that was featured before the movie. You can tell he was intending those spots specifically for the adults to drive in some of that point of clarity. And honestly, it didn't feel as cleanly woven into the narrative as I would like, especially when these points are coming at the expense of some welcome character development for the kids, for Violet, for Dash. And even on some level, I do think some of the character development surrounding our Mr. Incredible character is a little bit, let's call it undercooked. I mean, it's very much playing to the harried Mr. Mom stereotype that he can step in and fulfill all the same roles that she can, and yet he ultimately feels like the conclusion to his arc with Violet and the sense of conflict was more of he broke down, he was very honest about what everything was doing, and then she just accepts it. But at the same time, a lot of it is reliant on the assumption of altruism when it comes to the superheroes. And that's the other thing that kind of threw me off about this movie. If you were looking to add shades of moral ambiguity in terms of a little bit of complexity when it comes to, superheroes when placed in certain lights can have some of those elements that they cause collateral damage. They can hurt people. They can get in the way of things. It's kind of funny how often they brought up insurance basically to save superheroes from themselves. It's almost kind of funny when the system's backed in your favor, it makes your life so much easier to do your job, eh? Right? And you kind of wish this movie actually took the time to deconstruct some of those narratives, really drive some points into the objectivist framework, rather than having your villain deliver a very generic anti-objectivist monologue. I've seen this monologue before. I've read it before. I don't know. I don't mind the full philosophical side of this movie, and it is trying to aim higher. I can respect that. And I'm not going to downgrade a film because it ascribes to a philosophy that I don't really agree with anymore. The problem here for me is execution. You have a lot of good ideas, and you have some great comedic moments that if you played with more of that piece in terms of momentum, I think would better overall drive the narrative instead of, going into screed mode. It just doesn't help the film overall as a whole piece. And as such for me, that's why I'm a little bit cooler on this than I want to be. I still think it's good. I'm still going to give it a very light 7 out of 10, but I would only consider it mid-tier Pixar. It's not bottom-of-the-barrel Pixar. It's not Cars 2 or The Good Dinosaur, but it's not great Pixar either. You kind of wish that they could have done better. The animation is gorgeous. The vocal performances are really good, but the screenplay feels lesser. The stakes are not quite as high. I wish that more of the character arcs came to a more respectable conclusion. And again, when you're an objectivist storyteller, focus more on the story, not the speechifying. That will help get your point across so much cleaner. Hell, that's one of the big reasons why the Atlas Shrugged movies, all three of them, fell so badly flat in their face. beyond just being terrible. But yeah, Incredibles 2, far from terrible. I think it's still pretty enjoyable. It's actually a lot of fun to see in a crowded theater with a lot of kids. It certainly can feel kid-friendly, especially with Jack, some of the antics he gets up to. And there's enough sly pieces in the dialogue to make this just as family-friendly for adults as well. Now, I will say that they do have moments with some very explicit flashing lights, so if you have photosensitive epilepsy, probably not the best film to go to. There are warnings attached to it, but just save your money outside the theater. But beyond that, still a good sort of movie to check out. I mostly enjoyed it. Apologies if this gets too philosophical, but when it's in the text of the movie, and it's something that was very close to me growing up, I kind of had to mention it. But thanks a lot for watching. You'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. Get a little bit of collective action going on there. Yeah, I'll be cute about that. Hey, I came from that camp, I can be cute about it. Beyond that, if you want to actually see my schedule, it's linked down on my Instagram down below. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.